They asked Zhang Yuanzi where his father was, whether he had really run away from you, calling him an unnecessary child, and at the same time calling him a bad child. Quite loud laughter began to be heard, and incomprehensible screams continued. The little child stood surrounded by a huge number of people who continued to mock him. Slowly, a tear ran down the boy's cheek. Suddenly, a loud scream was heard, which attracted the attention of everyone around. The yellow-haired boy punched one of them, asking them what the hell they were talking about. He called them idiots, adding that they don't understand anything and believe any nonsense. The black-haired boy continued to look towards the one defending him. It was his older brother. The older brother grabbed the younger one and smiled, saying that it was time for them to go, and if they bothered him again, he just had to tell him. The black-haired boy thought that while his older brother was next to him, there won't be any problems because they are together, but everything couldn't be perfect. Their hands broke away from each other. The protagonist stopped feeling the warmth from his older brother. At that very moment, Zhang Yuanzi froze and began to look ahead anxiously. His older brother turned to him, his voice clearly not friendly. The yellow-haired one began to disappear. The younger one ran up to him, anxiously asking where he was. However, he smiled and said that he was sure that he would definitely cope. Our hero woke up covered in sweat. His whole face was covered in beads of sweat. Standing up, he grabbed his face and began to twitch anxiously. In high school, he began to suffer from a strange illness. His brain would uncontrollably throw up episodes from the past, including forgotten information. At the same time, the consciousness continuously collected and analyzed information, and as a result, the brain's control over the body reached an incredible degree. The biggest drawback is that when the symptoms subside, he gets a splitting headache. Doctors couldn't identify the cause, but thanks to a special medicine his mother brought from abroad, the protagonist's condition was brought under control. Having put the pills on the table, he heard shouts, a female voice shouting that it was time to get up, and also that he had received a package. The boy himself was thinking that lately the effect of the medicine was barely noticeable. It seemed like he was developing immunity. When he came out, he saw a blue-haired girl who immediately shouted that she would take him shopping with her. The boy answered the blue-haired girl with a not particularly pleased tone and said yes. At that time, I was examining the parcel and noticed that the sender was not indicated. Suddenly, he felt a rather terrifying aura, which made him very scared. At that very moment, he managed to shield himself from the blow of the old woman, who began to scream that he could not agree to go there with his aunt. Although the boy tried to explain that it was the blue-haired girl's initiative, she didn't hear him, continuing to threaten to break her legs. By this time, the girl had already arrived, explaining to his mother that if the guy didn't have normal clothes, then he wouldn't have a girlfriend because it was time. He was almost 20 years old. And she continued to scream, thinking that they were up to something, assuming that today they were going on a blind date. And just a few seconds later, a verbal altercation about marriage began between the daughter and mother. At this time, our hero was already unpacking that very parcel to see what was inside. There was some kind of black card inside, and the boy immediately began to examine it carefully. Yuanzi immediately noticed that it had a pleasant texture, comparing it to a business card from some rich club. He casually put it in his pocket on a subconscious level without even noticing it. There was also a letter in the box itself, and he immediately began to take it out to read it. Lei Yibin was the sender. It said that he had found something that could change his whole life by giving it to him. Reading all this, the black-haired boy became tense because they hadn't talked for a long time, and now he decided to give him some kind of suspicious card. Taking the phone in his hands, Yuanzi immediately greeted the person on the other side of the phone. He told Brother Bin that he was a good judge of character, but it wasn't his brother, but his father. The black-haired man's face changed instantly, and he began to laugh casually as he greeted his uncle. The brother's father immediately turned to our hero with a charged voice. Having said that right now at his institute, Bin disappeared somewhere, which scared the black-haired man quite a bit. Our hero couldn't believe that he was missing and started screaming, asking if they had called the police yet. Of course, his father had already called them since the boy had disappeared 2 days ago. His roommate replied that Bin had simply gone to bed without going anywhere and that he had been gone by morning. Naturally, our hero couldn't believe that a person could just disappear like that. Bin's father said that the school administration and the police told them to return home and wait for news. They didn't sleep all night. After listening to the end, Yuanzi hung up, saying in parting that he would call his grandfather or cousin since they worked in the Public Security Bureau. He immediately began to play the entire dialogue over in his head, trying to connect it with the message. Suddenly, he was distracted from these thoughts by the vibration of his phone in his pocket. A notification had arrived. However, the boy noticed that the map was missing. He was sure that he had put it here. He couldn't believe that she had simply evaporated into thin air, even though he had done it unconsciously. He remembered that she had done just that, and at that moment his condition had sharply worsened. His head started to split, but the boy didn't pay much attention to it, continuing to play everything over and over in his head. Grabbing the pills, he tried to find at least some way out of this situation. But with each passing second, the condition became worse and worse. His body began to be covered in beads of sweat. The black-haired man thought that Brother Bin had disappeared after sending him the black card. The card itself seemed strange. The guy decided to send it to him and not to the security bureau. Yuanzi assumed it was because he didn't trust the local bureau. His family had deep connections, but the words about changing his life did not leave him. Over and over again, he went over the words in the letter, trying to understand the meaning. Our main character's condition was worsening, so he decided to take some pills. He grabbed them and took a double dose at once, taking them. At that very moment, the old woman shouted that investigators from the Kangyan district had come to him and wanted to talk to him. Hearing this, the boy was naturally surprised and immediately began to think about it. If people from this department came to him, then it was clearly not a coincidence. At that moment, the old woman began to shout that her grandson would never do anything bad, while continuing to call him. Walking towards them, our boy took out his phone and started pressing something on it. Coming out to the door, he saw 3 people who immediately greeted the guy. The old woman told her grandson that she had already checked their documents, and then she began to threaten the guy, telling him that if he did something, it would be the end for him. Paying special attention to the two, Yuanzi thought that they were his cousin's colleagues. Approaching them with a not particularly pleased look, the black-haired man invited them inside, introducing himself. The white-haired man immediately apologized for disturbing him, asking if he knew Lei Yibing. Our hero pointed out where the trio should go, thinking to himself that his cousin was the captain of the 2nd detachment of the district, and therefore understood that these trio had not come for no reason. While they were sitting down, our hero continued to think, because they had to get permission before going to the colleague's family. The man in the red suit got straight to the point, saying they knew Yibin had sent him a package before he disappeared. Hearing this, the black-haired man immediately hit the table, jumped up and screamed, pretending that he was hearing about this for the first time. However, the man who was writing asked the black-haired man to calm down and be relaxed, without asking any counter-questions. Yuanzi replied that he had recently received a package, but the sender was not indicated. Naturally, the trio were interested in what was inside, but our hero replied that it was empty. The gray-haired man asked in surprise if it was really empty, but our hero stood his ground. After thinking for a moment, the man added that Yuanzi was the last person to communicate with Bin, so they had to check his room, phone, and computer. As if nothing had happened, our hero gave permission as calmly as possible, adding that he had nothing to hide. Having heard the consent, the man immediately turned to the girl, giving her the order to begin. She immediately stood up and put on gloves, asking him to pass her the phone. Our hero took out his phone with trembling hands, starting to mumble something to himself. His face turned red. Yuanzi explained that there could be content of different formats. But with a smile on her face, the girl replied that she was not interested. While the old woman and the man were having a pleasant conversation, the black-haired man interrupted their conversation, asking to tell them about the situation with his brother. The man, after thinking for a moment, said that the boy had disappeared right from his room while he was lying peacefully in his bed, and no one had been able to contact him for 24 hours. Upon hearing this answer, Yuanzi immediately realized that the investigation was at a dead end. But there was also the possibility that this man did not want to reveal the information to him. While sipping tea, the gray-haired man also added that if he noticed or learned anything new, he needed to contact them immediately. And then, with a sullen face and an angry voice, he added that otherwise he himself could become the missing person. Hearing this, our hero naturally tensed up, thinking that the man was clearly threatening him. He thanked him for the warning, noticing the noise coming from the room. Just a few minutes later, a girl came out of there, saying that her check was complete. And then, with a strange expression, she looked towards our main character. Seeing this facial expression, our hero immediately became embarrassed, realizing that she had seen everything. The old man immediately stood up and said that they were leaving, again asking the black-haired man to contact them if he remembered or learned anything. Literally a few seconds later, they left our hero's house. Having closed the doors, The old woman began to anxiously ask what could have happened to him and where he had disappeared to which our hero replied that he had a very bad headache and needed to lie down, asking to tell Grandpa about Bin when he returns, asking him to contact his uncle. Naturally, Grandma agreed with this because she was also worried about the boy. By this time, the trio had already reached their car. After sitting down, the man immediately turned to Guanya, asking if she had found anything. She immediately said that she had found quite a lot of information. At that very moment, the man became quite tense, telling her to tell him immediately. She explained with a serious face that the guy had gigabytes of hidden folders. He tried to disguise them. Their name is Vivo50. Upon hearing, the man's face changed. The girl continued, saying that there were many photographs of women in black tights inside, and also adding that the guy was a member of various groups. Hearing such a report from his subordinate, the gray-haired man immediately grabbed his face. He was not happy. The girl herself laughed at that very moment, asking her boss not to be so boring. She also said that there was no useful information on the guy's computer or phone, but the letter Lei Yibing sent him was hidden under a flower pot. So she assumed that there was a character card hidden inside along with the letter, but they didn't know what class it was. Closing his eyes, the man began to think internally, connecting all the girl's words. And then, with a smile on his face, he said that they would return to him tomorrow, adding that if the boy hadn't disappeared by that time. By the evening, Yuanzi's condition had improved, and he immediately began searching for information. Sitting at the computer, he assumed that Brother Bin's disappearance was deliberate, and the other side's target is that same black card that disappeared. Then the security bureau might not be the only party suspecting that he had a black card. A third party was very likely looking for Bin's brother. But his brother didn't contact the bureau, which means he doesn't trust them. He was in the same situation. He couldn't trust them completely, so the safest option was to tell his cousin about it. However, he also realized that he couldn't contact him right now, so he immediately started shouting, asking what he should do. Kay also didn't understand how to explain the mythical disappearance of the map. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was a blue-haired girl who was angry that the guy did not read the message and did not answer the phone. She was too angry, thinking that it was impossible to run away from the problem. Hearing these screams, Yuanzi began to get up from his chair, replying that he was already on his way. But as soon as he stood up, his condition suddenly worsened again. He felt something. His head began to hurt sharply, and he could barely stand on his feet. While the ant continued to scream, our hero did not understand what was happening because his head suddenly started to hurt. With each passing second, she began to hurt more and more. By this time, the old woman had come to the scream, telling her daughter that the boy had a headache and asking her not to bother him. She also asked the girl how her date had gone, to which she replied that it was good. The guy had his own house and apartment, but she didn't like him because he was too rich. At this time, our hero did not hear them at all. It seemed to him that he was in another reality. He couldn't understand what was happening to his body, but he knew perfectly well that he was feeling something he shouldn't be feeling. Suddenly, in the mirror, he noticed a black dot right on his forehead. Taking a closer look, he saw some kind of loading bar with percentages visible above it. He immediately remembered that the same drawing of a black moon was on the black card. Yuanzi was quite scared because he didn't know what would happen when the progress reached 100%. At that very moment, he realized that the card had not disappeared anywhere. It had mysteriously hidden itself inside his body. He remembered Bin's words that this power was something special that would change his life. Now he realized that someone wanted to get it, but his brother managed to send it to him. And then the mark reached 100%. A voice was heard saying that the character card reload was complete and the characteristics window opened. Looking at her, our hero saw that the system was asking him to give a name to the character. Something resembling handles appeared next to the system window. Taking it in his hand, Yuanzi immediately began to fill in the empty window where he needed to indicate his name. The boy wrote his real name in it, and the system immediately responded negatively, indicating that it was forbidden to indicate your real name. Without paying any attention to this, Zhang immediately began to write something new. Once he finished, the system notified that the name had been successfully chosen, giving the countdown to open the spirit world. She wished good luck to our protagonist, calling him Yuanshi Tianzun. It was this name he wrote down, and at that very moment the 10-second countdown began. Looking at the bill, our hero did not understand what kind of world was about to open up before him. But while he was thinking about this, 9 seconds had already passed, and the last second remained. Realizing that nothing could be done, he resigned himself to it and began to wait for what would happen next. The map immediately welcomed the guy to the tunnel of the night god Yulin, adding that the difficulty rank was S and the type was single, deadly. Our hero had to survive for 3 hours. The main quest consisted of exploring the spirit world, adding that it was forbidden to carry objects from the ordinary world. As soon as Yuanzi finished reading, he immediately began to lose consciousness, and literally a moment later I found myself in a completely unfamiliar place. The system window was still hanging before his eyes, and the black-haired man turned his attention to it again. At some point, a red system window appeared in front of our hero with a message on it, "Do not enter the temple." And then the system said that the tunnel was built at the end of the last century. During construction, a team of oxen came here for excavations, but disappeared inside, and no one has seen them since. As Yuanzi began to look around, he thought that he himself would have realized that he was in a tunnel. I thought to myself, could this really be the one from the urban legends? While walking along it, due to the fact that he was completely lost in thought, he hit the wall. Clutching his head, he mentally asked himself to calm down, immediately throwing away the thoughts that this was not the tunnel from the legends, because the real one looked completely different. He understood that in reality he was not that old. He had recently passed by it, his body trembling with fear. Sitting down, the boy began to think about everything. Realizing that this was a supernatural phenomenon, he was drawn into an urban legend to complete a task given by some mysterious force. The voice gave him 2 tasks. The first was to survive for 3 hours, and the second was to explore the spirit world, difficulty S, solo type. If there was a word to survive, then there was danger here, the boy continued to think. Well, to explore means to wander through the tunnel, but one thing didn't go well with the other, because it was dangerous here. Standing up, he walked slowly deeper, thinking that if there was a task, then there should be a reward for it. I thought along the way that if I were to believe that panel, then his class was a night wanderer. His level was 0, not first, so he first needed to earn this class, but I also didn't understand what god they were talking about. These thoughts weighed too heavily on his mind. Yuanzi tried to push them away. With every second, he made his way further and further, looking around carefully, trying to notice every little detail. At some point, he noticed some liquid, but it had already dried up. Suddenly, some dark silhouette appeared, which frightened the black-haired man. Looking at this creature, Yuanzi did not understand what it was that stood before him. However, she did not make any sounds, slowly approaching our hero. The closer this silhouette came, the more its silhouette became visible, and as soon as the face gradually began to appear, the most disgusting scream was heard. And after him came several more of the same creatures. They were clearly not in a friendly mood. Upon closer inspection, Yuanzi noticed that they were rotting corpses. Immediately turning in the opposite direction, I started running away from them. At some point, while he was running and looking around, he noticed something strange. Those creatures stretched their hands towards him, still walking slowly. Our hero did not understand why they did not pursue him, even though he was running away. And at that very moment, I sensed danger and began to look forward. He noticed that in the direction he was running right now, there were even more of these creatures. Now he understood why they didn't pursue him. They had no reason to do so because they surrounded him. One of these corpses raised his hand, pointing his finger to the side. Our hero turned around and saw a huge tunnel that went even further. Although he was still afraid, Yuanzi realized that they were not attacking him, but rather, they were showing him the way. Our hero began to look carefully in the direction where this undead was pointing. At this very time, in one of the huge buildings, real darkness could be felt. This whole negative aura was emitted by some incomprehensible creature standing and looking through a small crack into the distance. Yuanzi ran at full speed, trying to leave this place as quickly as possible. As he ran, he looked around and at some point noticed a bright light far ahead. And literally a couple of minutes later, he was able to run out of this cave. Behind him, the disgusting screams continued to be heard as he turned around. He noticed how the very undead that had shown him the way was still following him. Starting to run away in fear even further, the black-haired man thought that the panel had clearly stated that this was a single death-type mission, so it was logical to assume that these corpses were attacking him. However, he also did not understand why they showed him the way and left him so easily. At some point, he thought that it was perhaps a trap. And so, after thinking for a while, he decided to leave this place because the dead could go berserk, so the best option was to leave this place. Continuing to follow straight along the trampled path among the trees, the protagonist noticed that it was too quiet around, because usually at this time of year, the night forest is filled with the noise of mountain insects. But he had no intention of stopping, continuing to move forward, moving further and further away from that very cave. At some point, he noticed something that clearly shouldn't have been in the forest. Before him appeared neatly laid out concrete bricks, and in the distance a wooden building could be seen, which was covered with cobwebs. Near the stairs, there were some rather old things that had started to fall apart over time. Looking around, the main character assumed that this was an abandoned temple. Suddenly, his face was filled with horror and beads of sweat began to run down his face. He began to remember the very warning that was written in the window. It said to stay as far away from the temple as possible. But our hero also realized that he had already left the tunnel. Assuming that in this case he needed to enter this abandoned building, it suddenly dawned on him that the corpses could have led him out on purpose. Clutching his face, the black-haired man began to reason again, because now he had two quests in front of him. But if you put them together, it turns out that he must wander around the temple for 3 hours and survive. He understood that if he went forward, there was a high probability of dying, but if he turned back, he would definitely die. At that moment, I remembered the Bin brothers, who spoke about changing life. Swallowing his saliva, he thought about what had been said, categorically not to go to the temple. However, according to the quest, he was obliged to explore it, so he decided to give it a try. As he began to slowly climb the stairs, he looked around carefully. When he suddenly noticed a light ahead, it puzzled him quite a lot. There was a sound behind him that sounded like footsteps. Turning towards the sound, the black-haired man's entire body shuddered. The sound began to come from everywhere, each time getting louder and louder. The protagonist turned around anxiously, not understanding where the noise was coming from. Peering into the tall grass, the protagonist began to examine it carefully, thinking that usually after strange footsteps some kind of ghost appears. With each passing second, the steps became louder and louder, and now distinct steps could be heard. His whole face began to be covered in beads of sweat. Now the boy was sure that someone was approaching him. So without thinking, he immediately rushed towards the door, thinking that what if his brother became a ghost and he was now taking out his anger on him? He shouted that his younger brother had done nothing wrong. The boy continued to run. He was very scared. Without even realizing it, he jumped over several stairs and into the temple. He stumbled and hit the temple door, thereby opening it. Before he could even get his bearings, he began to roll over, hitting the floor. Sitting up, leaning against the wall, the black-haired man tried to catch his breath and come to his senses as quickly as possible. Everyone was also looking towards the street from where those very steps were coming. However, there was silence there now, the same as when he ran through the forest. The guy didn't understand why he couldn't hear any footsteps anymore. Deciding that the best option was to close the door, he locked it. Starting to wipe the sweat from his face, the main character breathed a sigh of relief. Inside the temple, there were lit candles, from which a bright light emanated. Our hero immediately began to look around in order to understand what was happening, immediately paying attention to the stone statues that stood there. There was a smile on both faces. They were looking somewhere at the same point. At some point, our hero thought that they were examining him. In the center, between them, stood a more mature statue, which, compared to the other two, seemed more grown up, still looking attentively towards these huge sculptures. The black-haired man thought that from where he was standing, they looked too bulky. Their faces did not leave the black-haired man. He did not stop looking at them. At some point, the young man noticed that the huge statue should be holding something in its hand, but some detail was missing. So he immediately began to look around again. Noticing some inscriptions, I assumed that this was information about the temple. There were inscriptions on the stone from the early Ming dynasty, so the boy guessed that they were more than 500 years old. And at that very moment, Yuanzi began to fully understand the situation. After all, if the temple was requested, then someone must have changed the candles since they are new. Slowly, he began to turn his gaze towards them, starting to look more and more closely with each passing second. Having examined them, our hero again fell into thought, thinking about a member of the brigade. After all, this scene was generated to fit the urban legend, or it was always there, suggesting that in this case, the team also stumbled upon a temple. In any of these cases, the protagonist was in trouble, so if he wanted to survive, he had to look for clues. His face changed dramatically. He was not going to die here, he was going to survive. Gathering his courage, he approached the dead body lying next to the candles. After examining him carefully, he noticed that the sternum and several ribs were broken, and in his right shoulder there were small cracks, and the boy also noticed that there was something in his pocket. Having caught his breath a little, he nevertheless decided to check the undead's pocket. Another brother disappeared last night, making this the third temple student to have mysteriously vanished. The master ordered them to hide everything from the pilgrims, fearing that this would affect the attendance of the temple. He thought that their talismans were enough to banish any signs. He didn't want to worry the master, but he had a bad feeling. The brothers had been disappearing more and more often lately. He needs to go and find the eldest brother to discuss this. And from that moment on, 3 days passed, during which time 3 more disappeared. But he and the eldest brother did not find any clues. The nights in the temple became quieter than ever. This is exactly what was written on the sheets, and that's where the story ended. The black-haired man suggested that the dead worker had hidden the temple servant's notes in his pocket, thinking that it was an important clue. The reason for the decline of the temple on Mount Sanadao was never revealed, and if he could uncover the reason, Yuanzi wondered if he could complete the second main quest. Realizing that this was all the information there was, the protagonist decided to go further, assuming that there was a chance of running into danger along the way. But he also understood that according to legend, one worker managed to survive. So if he followed his trail, he would be able to get out of here. Opening the doors, Yuanzi again noticed that it was too quiet. Trying to come to his senses, the boy again assumed that someone was waiting for him outside. But staying in place will not lead to anything. He was obliged to go further, so after coming to his senses, he left the temple, starting to move further and further away from the temple. At the same time, listening to every sound, trying to hear every little detail. At some point, he came up against some kind of gate again, which led to another building, inside which the light was also on. This time, Yuanzi was no longer so frightened. He tried to restrain himself. However, he had already decided for himself to go further, so he went inside. Entering, he looked around carefully, again noticing the dead bodies. The entire route, from the starting point to here, was littered with construction crews. It was hard for him to get used to such a sight, because almost all the people received terrible injuries in the shoulder area before they died. Suddenly, he heard some words that asked for help. They scared him to death. The voices began to grow louder and louder. Yuanzi peered into the distance. Our hero, shedding tears, thought that any sane person would have left here long ago. But now he heard for sure cries for help. Clenching his face, he blamed everything on Brother Bin. He started thinking that if he managed to get out alive, he would send his uncle all his educational materials from the hidden folders, so that the father could see how diligent his son was. Walking further and further, at some point our hero noticed the corpse again, noticing that this skeleton looked much more intact than the others. After examining him, Yuanzi saw that only his shoulder blades were crushed, just like the skeleton in the main hall. Moreover, this same skeleton had some papers visible from its pocket. Having taken them out, Yuanzi saw some kind of talisman, a book, and a mirror. Starting to look closely at these objects. At that very moment, the system notified our hero that an object from the spirit world had been discovered. This talisman was called a banishing one and was created by the powerful god of the night. And also its uses were described. Yuanzi thought that it could be very useful. Having finished with the talisman, the black-haired man was about to look at the book. Opening it, he immediately began to read that 2 days and a half years had passed since someone joined Mount Sando. In the temple of the goddess, he learned to read and write. The elder brother said that as soon as the master returned to the mountain after cleansing the souls, he would officially accept him. Cultivation through soaking the soul in moonlight is the introductory method to becoming a night priest. It was such a difficult time, with the rebellion of Prince Yan, that the smoke of war enveloped the sky. The master, the most powerful of the priests of Shanghai, must cleanse the souls of the restless, all in order to prevent the onslaught of the Yin curse from falling upon the common people. After reading this, Yuanzi guessed that it was a diary, as it recorded the cultivation experience and life routine of the temple. At some point, the main character read to the point where it talks about a living corpse whose chest was covered in blood. It also said not to trust the master, after which the remaining pages were torn out. At that very moment, goosebumps ran all over our hero's body. Moving to the mirror, the guy felt a rather strange aura. He began to look at it carefully, examining it from all sides, and as soon as he looked at the reflection itself, his face immediately changed. After all, right behind his back stood some kind of creature that resembled a ghost. This scared him enough that Yuanzi screamed at the top of his lungs. Immediately using the talisman, he attached it to the ghost's forehead, shouting for this unclean creature to go away. And after falling to the ground, he immediately began to ask his brother to have mercy on him. Taking the mirror in his hands again, Yuanzi hoped that the talisman had worked. However, this creature was still standing behind him. His face filled with tears. His shoulder became even more numb. His arms and legs went numb. At some point, he began to imagine how these dead bodies were encouraging him. And at that very moment, he heard rather scary sounds that tore him out of his thoughts. Yuanzi immediately began banging his head on the ground, screaming that trouble after trouble was coming. The protagonist began to hear footsteps behind him again. He could not come to terms with the fact that he would become one of these dead people. Having hidden in one of the buildings, he began to look out onto the street. The steps did not stop dying down, becoming louder and louder, then quieter and quieter. At some point, Yuanzi noticed some red heels. Covering his mouth to keep from screaming, he thought of a pair of red shoes in a temple of the ancient Ming dynasty. Believing he's going crazy, he slowly goes crazy. As soon as he saw that they turned in his direction, he immediately hid. Exhaling heavily, the boy tried to come to his senses, looking at my trembling hand, which was holding that very mirror. He didn't understand how he could escape from here. Besides, he noticed that his shoulder was aching badly. It was about to crack. After resting a little, he went outside and started running. All this time, the ghost on my shoulder was getting heavier and heavier. Never in his life had it been so hard for him to move. Having reached the temple again with his last strength, Yuanzi fell to the ground. Gradually, the ghost began to disappear. His assumption turned out to be correct, because the main hall was a safe zone. After resting a bit, he stood up and began to stretch his shoulder. At first, he was able to escape from the strange shoes, and then he crawled to the main hall with the ghost on his shoulder. But if they attacked at the same time, the black-haired man understood that it would definitely be the end for him. One of the important rules of any horror game is to stay close to the safe zone. Suddenly, the system notified our hero of the successful completion of the first main quest, and the reward calculation began. Seeing this notification, Yuanzi couldn't believe that he had completed the quest. The protagonist's experience has increased. He has also received a banishing talisman, and access to the inventory has been unlocked. In addition to this, the system gave 36 hours to rest. The countdown to the next opening of the spirit world began. In an instant, Yuanzi returned to his home room. He immediately fell onto the bed and exhaled heavily, noticing that even the air felt much lighter here. Suddenly jumping up, he did not understand where his talisman had gone. And at that very moment, some window appeared in front of him, which the young guy began to carefully study. After examining the window, he noticed that it was inventory, thinking that it opened as soon as he thought about the item. The equipment worked intuitively. At the level of consciousness, he didn't even need to learn how to use it. Yuanzi compared it to a game. Besides, he noticed that his level was still 0 and class abilities were not available to him. Taking the phone in his hand, he decided to talk to his cousin. At some point, he even began to think about what he should tell those investigators from the bureau about what happened. But there was also a high risk that he would be taken for a madman and locked up. However, on the other hand, his brother had disappeared inexplicably, and that investigator said that he could have disappeared too. Therefore, at that very moment, Yuanzi assumed that the investigators knew about the spirit world, so he decided to call. The man immediately praised the boy for being able to escape from the spirit world, which greatly puzzled our hero because he knew about it. The old man said that Yuanzi was now a wanderer of the spiritual world, and the only difference between them was that he was registered, while the guy was not, adding that he could not tell him everything now. After all, the guy had to make a choice. The government had two approaches to wanderers of the spiritual world. He had the right to decide for himself which one suited him best. The first was to join them and become official. The second is to be a solitary practitioner. All he needs to do in this case is provide all the information about himself and also promise not to use his skills for illegal activities. Our hero naturally agreed to join them. The old man told the guy to gather his strength. He was going to pick him up at 8 in the morning. After a short pause, Yuanzi apologized, as he had concealed the fact that the package contained a map. The investigator from the bureau praised the guy for his caution. And then that very morning came. Our hero got up early. Leaving the room, he immediately called his grandmother, saying that he was hungry. He thought to himself that he hadn't been able to sleep, because every time he closed his eyes, he seemed to see a ghost behind him. The old woman was surprised to see her grandson because he woke up early. The aunt noticed the boy's condition and decided to check the trash can for used napkins. Running into the room, she also shouted that she would even check under the bed. Approaching his grandfather, Yuanzi immediately asked about the construction crew, which surprised his grandfather. The gray-haired man apologized because the situation happened a long time ago, and he no longer remembered all the details. An old woman intervened in their conversation, saying that the worker they had found had soon disappeared. And then, going up to her grandson, she sent him to wash up. Standing up, Yuanzi immediately fell into thought, because in this case, he again entered the temple after 36 hours and did not return. From this information, the boy realized that the second stage would be more difficult, and if he wanted to survive, he needed to get as much information as possible now. Coming out of the bathroom, he shouted that he needed to take a walk. Naturally, upon hearing this, the grandmother became angry because her grandson had not eaten, but he no longer heard her. At that very moment, the grandfather silently looked towards his grandson. Going outside, the main character noticed a parked limousine. He began to peer warily around the corner and examine the car. Suddenly, the door opened and the man sitting inside told us to get into the car. Continuing to look around warily, Yuanzi headed towards the car. After getting into the car, the investigator asked the guy if he wanted anything to drink. Our hero answered, "Cola," but there was none in the car. The man said that they were going to fill out paperwork and intended to give some introductory information. He introduced himself. His name was Dronzer, a third-level wanderer scout class. The investigator began to talk about the spirit world, a supernatural space, the nature of which scientists still cannot explain, despite all the research and attempts to study it. They have not yet managed to understand how it works. The spirit world exists in their world and outside of its boundaries at the same time. Only certain people can get into it and to become one of those people. You need a card. They call it a character card. Those who get it must pass a test mission. If you pass the test, you gain the skills and characteristics of your class. The mechanism by which the spirit world selects wanderers has not yet been studied, and the method for distributing classes is also unclear. Sometimes cards appear immediately in a person's body. Some found cards on the side of the road, while others received them by clicking on a random link on the internet. And completing the test mission is just the beginning. If a wanderer wants to level up and become stronger, he needs to take on new quests, entering the spirit world again and again. The old man also asked the boy not to worry too much, since tasks often don't appear, and not every scenario is mortally dangerous, and he began to talk about himself. After hearing about the joint raids, our hero compared it to an MMORPG game. Upon hearing this, the gray-haired man praised the guy because he grasps everything on the fly. He explained to the guy that solo runs are the most dangerous, with a high mortality rate, but team runs are better, with worlds like death and penalties where you won't die even if you fail. Naturally, Yuanzi had a logical question. What is the danger of solitary worlds? In team worlds, he will work together, and solo worlds are selected specifically for his class. Using himself as an example, he said that in solitary confinement, he had to take on the role of a detective, tracking and hiding from opponents and surviving in the wilderness. Hearing this answer, the black-haired boy immediately began to think. Suddenly, the young boy shouted that his brother Bin had also ended up in the spirit world, but the old man replied that he was most likely already dead. Upon hearing this, our hero immediately became lost in space, and the investigator explained that too much time had already passed. Having added that the test in the spirit world lasts from several hours to, in the worst case, 2 days, and there had been no news from the guy for 4 days, Yuanzi screamed upon hearing this. However, the old man also added about higher stages, which may take longer. After listening to the investigator, the main character thought, assuming that his brother Bin had moved on to a new stage. He hoped for this. Lee interrupted the boy's thoughts by asking what his morality score was. Our hero was surprised by this question, immediately opening the system window and saying, 60. Lee explained that the main problem with all newcomers was their morale, and added that all wanderers within his city would receive a quest to eliminate him if he dropped below 60. Naturally, upon hearing this, our hero was surprised and asked if he really couldn't do anything bad his whole life. I immediately started thinking about watching adult content and doing the same. It seemed to him that at that very moment his life had come to an end. Hearing this, the old man laughed quite loudly, telling the young man not to worry. Offenses such as theft, assault, robbery, and the like deducted from 1 to 5 points, and murder deducted 10. In short, Lee told our hero to just be a good person. Our hero immediately fell into deep thought. But after putting it aside, he decided that he would help the grandmothers cross the road. However, he also noted that Lee did not explain the purpose of the morality indicator at all, suggesting that he did not know. When suddenly the car stopped, they arrived. After getting out of the car, Our hero immediately asked the investigator whether sponsoring a young lady was considered a violation of morality. The gray-haired man explained that losing morality is as easy as gaining it, citing the example of how criminal organizations of wanderers make charitable contributions. To sum it all up, if you have money, it's easy to raise morale. Lee also told Yuanzi that battles between wanderers do not take away points, and then slowly moved on to tell him about their organization. They called themselves the Five Elements Alliance, and within the faction, there were 5 factions that represented the 5 classes: Wood Demon, Scout, Firemaster, Water Ghost, and Ghoul. Having told a little about the past, and also that their faction is less than 20 years old. And then, starting to get angry, he told me about the tree demons who are obsessed with nature and animals. Well, and along the way, I didn't say anything about each faction. Well, I didn't forget to praise the faction of Scouts, saying that they are truly wise, calm, and reasonable. Lee also talked about the abilities of each faction member. At one point, Yuanzi joked that the Scouts were useless, but seeing the investigator's anger, he immediately apologized. And now they have already started to go up in the elevator. Once they begin to talk about what they say, once the Scouts, have crossed the stage of transcendence, they develop outstanding combat skills. Our hero was interested in Lee telling him more about the Night Wanderer. The investigator explained that even at the initial stage of development, this class possesses enormous combat power and killing skills. In addition to the fact that they have skills with souls, purifying corpses, and controlling ghosts, Lee also said that they are an incredibly rare class. This is all because the capital's Thai sect is recruiting them from all over the country. He felt sorry for him, because he wanted to get one for himself. Suddenly he became thoughtful, turning to our hero and asking what class he was. Embarrassed, our hero replied that he was a wanderer of the night. After a minute of silence, the investigator suddenly jumped up and grabbed the guy, shouting at him to repeat himself. And as soon as he heard a positive answer, he immediately began to hug the guy. He was happy about it. Having said that, the Night Wanderer is an incredibly valuable addition. Along the way, he told how the girl from the Union of 100 Flowers wanted the Wanderer so much that she even slept with him. Moreover, the man casually asked what kind of spirit world it was, to which Yuanzi replied, Yuanshi Tianzun. Investigator Lee immediately fell into a wild stupor. Somehow, it was thoughtfully said that this was an excellent choice. Eventually, they went to fill out the paperwork. Lee said that the starting salary was 20,000 a month plus subsidies for missions. Hearing this, the black-haired man's eyes immediately lit up with a bright money light. They went on a tour, and there were also ordinary people working within their organization. Afterwards, they went to Investigator Lee's office. Upon entering, he asked Yuanzi to make herself comfortable while he prepared the papers. Our protagonist sat down in a chair while the gray-haired man prepared the contract. Their silence was broken by Guanya coming in and asking if they needed help. Upon seeing her, our hero immediately became embarrassed, because it was she who was checking his computer. Lee was delighted to see her and asked her to brief the newcomer while he went to talk to the boss. She immediately smiled, asking if the guy liked older girls. The departing investigator explained to Yuanzi that the girl liked to insert inappropriate jokes. Then he added, telling Guan to behave more restrainedly. Sitting down next to our hero, she said that she had the answer to all his questions. And then she noticed that their boss was too happy, but she didn't attach any importance to it. She asked to give the guy the ID of the spirit world, or her phone number, asking if her boss had already given her a basic education. While filling out the papers, Yuanzi replied to her that he had conveyed the main idea. The girl told him about her new passport, which surprised the black-haired man. Guan explained that the system had already explained to the guy that he couldn't use his real name. After all, they divide the classes of the spirit world into 2 categories. The first are the orthodox classes. The second are the dark classes. The dark classes hunted the orthodox classes, but their category was usually stronger. Putting down his pen, Yuanzi realized that the names they had given him were not real, and Guan confirmed this. After thinking for a bit, our hero praised the girl, because he concluded that she was an experienced hunter. She pressed herself against him, praised him for his kind words, and asked if he had a girlfriend, to which she heard a negative answer. Guan was surprised by this, because she thought that he already had someone. And then, taking out her phone, she asked if the guy wanted her to arrange a love meeting for him. Yuanzi stood up and refused with an innocent face, intending to find the girl using the traditional method. She, laughing, said that she liked him, to which the black-haired man reciprocated. Hearing this, Guan was quite surprised and told him not to anger her. After all, she was sure that he had a girlfriend, but our hero again refused. With pathos, she continued to talk about their faction. Along the way, he said that after the test, he would join the ranks of the White Tiger. And then she began to read the completed forms. After reading the ID of the spirit world, she called the name, that is, the new name, too pretentious. And as soon as I reached the classroom, I immediately became tense. Surprised, I reread the text written by Yuanzi several more times. Turning to him, she asked anxiously if he was a wanderer of the night, to which I immediately received a positive response. Now Guan understood why their boss was so happy. In an instant, she moved closer to Yuanzi, holding his face. The sister began to threaten the boy, telling him not to even dare to run away anywhere. The embarrassed guy, overexcited, shouted that he would never betray her. Suddenly, she noticed the level, which surprised her quite a lot. Well, I turned my gaze to the current test, seeing the Yulin tunnel. She couldn't understand why him. And then she turned towards the guy again in surprise, asking if he really was there. Yuanzi didn't quite understand why Guan was so wary, but he decided to say that he had questions regarding the test. From behind him, he heard a heavy sigh. There stood a man who continued to sigh heavily. At this point, all the protagonist's fighting spirit disappeared. Guan went after the boss, and the man told the boy to follow him. As he walked, Yuanzi deduced from their reactions that he had been faced with an extremely difficult test. The man himself began his story by saying that they usually have information about the test, but with the tunnel things were different. Sitting down at the laptop, Yuanzi began to carefully study the information. However, the maximum difficulty rank in the base was A, but his challenge was S rank. He couldn't understand this, but he couldn't just leave it like that, because the 36 hours would soon be over. At some point, he did find information about the Yulin tunnel, which said there was 0 survival rate in it, and that nothing was known. Naturally, Yuanzi was very scared, because the note said that this spirit world was critically dangerous, and there was not a single known case of passage. At this time, the boss was sipping wine pleasantly, lighting a cigar in joy and thinking about how he was going to make a name for himself. And he was very lucky, because he came across a night wanderer with a clean reputation. Along the way, he recalled how he reported this to his boss, who promised to reward him. He couldn't be happier, thinking that Yuanzi had appeared at the perfect time. His thoughts were interrupted by Guan, who kicked the door open. Coming closer, she told them what kind of test their newcomer was going through. And as soon as the boss heard about the tunnel, he immediately spat out all the wine in surprise. Li jumped up and grabbed his head. He couldn't believe his ears, immediately heading towards the door, intending to talk to the guy. However, when he entered, he saw that their newcomer was already terrified. Time after time, Yuanzi repeated that he was a dead man. Seeing this state, the investigator became a little upset. However, putting his hands on the guy's shoulders, he said that for every newcomer, the first test is a solitary one, and everyone encountered difficulties. But these words did not encourage our hero in the least. The investigator was going to send a request to the senior officials to find out more information. Having sent our hero home and said that he would contact him as soon as he found out something, Investigator Li asked Guan to accompany our hero. As he walked, our hero turned to the girl and addressed her. He asked her if she thought this was his last time here because he thought he was going to die. However, she, with a smile on her face, asked him not to worry. She promised that she would remain faithful to him as a widow. And then she asked the guy to get into the car. With a sad face, Yuanzi went towards the car. Sitting down, he was still quite tense. Approaching the window, Guan assured the guy that their chief would help him with information, and she herself could only wish him good luck, and also added that she would be glad to see him again next time. There was silence in the organization's building. Everyone was busy with their own business. No one talked to each other. Guan wrote information about our hero on a piece of paper. He was a Scorpio, so she thought he could be seduced. She threw down her pen and seemed very disappointed, having pasted this leaflet into one of the books that was about their detachment. Turning to Waitan, she asked him if he thought the boy could handle it, to which the black-haired man replied that Tai had some information about the tunnel, but the chances were too slim. After all, they have a lot of information, and for clearing the S-rank challenge, there will be a high reward. Guan exhaled heavily, agreeing, and also adding that Yuanzi would not be bothered by the artifacts. However, each of them had a narrow range of capabilities, so they would most likely lose both the boy and the artifacts. There were only 2 ways to obtain them: by getting them in the spirit world, or by killing the wanderer and knocking them out of him. Both options were problematic, because if a person dies in the spirit world, the artifact remains there. Wai himself said that the guy was just unlucky, because the Qingming festival had recently passed, which is when the tunnel opens. With a heavy sigh, Guan agreed with her colleague. At this time, their boss was in his office. He was furiously typing something into his phone and apologizing to someone. Asking for help with information, he really wanted to save the Night Wanderer. Therefore, I tried in any way to get information to help him. Investigator Lee wrote to the elder asking him to help him. By this time, our main character had already returned home. As he entered, he sadly said that he had returned. Grandma immediately said that his cousin was already home, noticing that his grandson looked as if all the juices had been squeezed out of him. As he passed by, Yuanzi sadly greeted his brother, who also greeted him. The cousin asked why he was looking for him. However, the main character asked him to forget about it because he believed that he would not be able to help him. Continuing to eat, the cousin said that he knew that Commander Lee had visited them, so he was powerless here. At this point, the blue-haired girl appeared and shouted joyfully that she had brought a wrinkle remedy. But both brothers refused, saying that they did not need it. At that very moment, Grandma chimed in, calling them brats. Approaching her cousin, she immediately hit him, shouting that he was already 30 years old, but he looked 40. She was angry because he still didn't have a girlfriend. After all, when their uncle came last year, he thought that he was their son, not their grandson. Translating it to the point that if he got it wrong, the guy looks manly. The little brother asked his grandmother to calm down, saying that he had to go to work in the morning, so he would prefer to rest rather than argue. Yuanzi heard this and asked him what his business was, and his brother replied that 2 people had disappeared in the tunnel yesterday and they still hadn't been found, adding that it was a secret matter so that the younger one wouldn't blab. Granny and Auntie immediately started talking to each other that it was time to close this tunnel. The protagonist himself began to think again, assuming that they had entered the tunnel and were unable to get out. He wondered if they could hold out there for 3 hours. He was also comforted by the feeling that he was not the only one experiencing this horror. At this very time, somewhere in the capital, the weather was excellent. Rays of sun were breaking through the dense foliage. Under one of these trees lay an old man sleeping soundly. A man in black approached him and addressed him. It was Elder Song who said that he had received a letter from the son of the Fu family, having told that they are asking for information for the Night Wanderer about the Yulin Tunnel. Hearing this, the grandfather immediately grabbed the object lying on his stomach. They said that a festival had recently taken place, so they were expecting a cheerful replenishment in the ranks of Night Wanderers, but no one could cope with the tunnel. He allowed the files to be sent, since their sect had long since abandoned attempts to pass the Yuling test, and the level of confidentiality could be lowered. The elder also asked to remind young Fu that they were not dealing with just an S-rank trial. Grandpa asked me to tell them not to save this wanderer, because he is doomed to die soon. Yulin Tunnel's difficulty was disappointing even among S-rank trials. Each S-rank spirit world contains something unusual, be it a rare item or important information. In order to clear the Yuling trial, the Tai sect sent 2 first-level Night Wanderers to Shanghai at once. This is possible because this trial is open to Night Wanderers. For several months, their people prepared to enter the Yulin Tunnel, and one day it opened. But the result was that 1 Night Wanderer disappeared already in the first stage of the test. The other one was able to return, but after re-entering he also disappeared. Both Wanderers were well equipped. It was from then on that the elders of the Tai sect completely abandoned the idea of clearing out this spirit world. Grandpa also added that if someone manages to gather more information, progress will begin, and also mentioned some kind of meeting. It was a gathering of the Wanderers of the Night, and it was after this that he allowed the servants to leave. It was already night. The black-haired hero was lying in his bed, replaying the conversation with my aunt in my head, which said that horror games are not a perversion, but rather strengthen the psyche and force one to study monsters. She was fascinated by the characters in the game. Yuanzi thought that the spirit world was like a game, so he assumed that there must be strict rules there too. However, this thought was interrupted by a call from Guan. He immediately picked up the phone, and she started saying that the chief had sent him a file. The file contained information about a tunnel, and the girl decided to play it safe. The main character thanked her and asked her to convey his gratitude to the boss. At some point, the girl turned to our guy. Reading what the boss sent him, our hero answered Gon without thinking, who, in the same sweet voice, said that he was obliged to pass the test and treat her. She also said that this was his promise. Our hero happily agreed, but his face said otherwise. After hanging up the phone, he again sank into his own thoughts. The girl herself didn't know whether this information would help the guy. However, she really hoped for it. Yuanzi began to study the received files. After reading it, he assumed that the statue was some kind of deity of all the local priests. There is currently no confirmation of this beautiful woman's existence. Surviving the first 3 hours in the temple was not too difficult, but while reading the notes, he was attacked by a vengeful spirit, which sucks out all the internal energy from its victim. Salvation from it is a candle, and anyone who read the writings in the temple will be cursed and mercilessly killed by the spirit. Its influence can only be dispelled for a time, about 15 minutes. Also, if you sit near a candle for a long time, a person can become fearless, but reckless courage is destructive in that world. The candle forced me to go further and explore the temple. After sitting in the main hall for about half an hour, I suddenly heard a cry for help coming from the courtyard. Having read this, our hero had already figured this out, but he thought that the amulet was the statue itself. Yuanzi also heard cries for help, but it was not a chilling roar. That banyan tree is incredibly dangerous. You always have to keep it in sight. The wanderer assumed that it was calling for help. The shoes were invited to dance, but because the movements were too difficult, they were impossible to remember, which is why the test was failed. After this, the shoes began to pursue the wanderer, and the shoes ended up breaking his ribs. And finally, the wanderer who had passed the test did not understand how a newcomer could pass this difficult test without preparation. After reading this report to the end, Yuanzi became lost in thought. He suggested that the shoes were responsible for the death of those workers. He also understood that he knew about dancing thanks to his uncle. But his chances weren't great either, since his level was 0, and the test was being taken by a first-level wanderer. Suddenly it dawned on him and he screamed, because he didn't have to be a dancer. He realized that he just needed to remember the movements, and for him it was easy, because he had a perfect memory. While our hero was thinking about all this, Guan was taking a sweet bath, also thinking about the guy. Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from our hero. She picked it up and asked him if he had read everything, to which Yuanzi responded positively, saying that he did not fully understand some points. She explained to him that in the spirit world there are a great many artifacts that differ. An item with a condition is one of the most difficult, and they are also quite rare. She also explained that the red shoes mentioned in the file were most likely one of them. Guan also explained that she would not memorize the movements. Yuanzi also asked if he could take some medicine with him, to which she told him to take it beforehand. She couldn't give a precise answer, but upon hearing this, the black-haired man thanked her. She called Yuanzi baby with a smile on her face, adding that today was a lucky day for Scorpios. And now the countdown has begun. 5 minutes left. There was a flask with pills on the table. Yuanzi himself was getting dressed at this time. He was planning to survive. And finally, there was a minute left. Time dragged on. Having closed the doors tightly, the main character exhaled heavily. Having taken some pills, he thought that they would come in handy. And so the spirit world began to open. The system wished good luck to the main character. Eventually, he found himself in this temple again. Looking around, he was now sure that he had definitely returned here. He eventually spat out the pills, thinking to himself that he was a genius. After all, his plan worked with these pills. He will be able to fulfill the condition of the red shoes. It was with these thoughts that he put them in his pocket. And then he turned his attention to the street, assuming that day never comes here. From that moment on, he decided to consider this location as a game. He could touch some objects to see their description. Yuanzi thought that during his first attempt, he didn't dare touch the candle, so he didn't know it was an artifact. He was pleased with the information he received and began to think to himself about how he will pass this test. The pills were his trump card, but he also knew they weren't a guaranteed solution. During all this time, he managed to prepare well. However, he was still very scared. Looking out into the courtyard, he thought that the courtyard had already been explored, and the quest itself was throwing up danger at every step. Yuanzi also understood that the longer he stayed in one place, the worse his condition would become. It made no difference whether he was hiding or walking. It was with these thoughts that he left the hall and moved on. As he walked further, he continued to look around, looking for the slightest clues, and also listening to any rustle. But everything was the same. There was that same piercing silence. Only the sound of his footsteps could be heard. He was looking for at least something. At some point, he ran into the tree mentioned in the file. He remembered that it was dangerous here, but now it looked like an ordinary tree. Hoping that if he hangs around here, progress will be made, Yuanzi decided to take a closer look, noticing the wells. Deciding that this was a bad sign, he decided to go around. And at that very moment, he stepped on a stick that was lying there, breaking it. There was a cracking sound, and as soon as the boy looked closer, he noticed a skeleton. However, now the corpses did not frighten him, because he had managed to look at them. After examining it, the boy was surprised because the skeleton was well preserved. He fell on his stomach and his head was turned. It looked like someone had broken his neck. Yuanzi wondered who could have done this. Suddenly, a cry began to be heard calling for Zhang Yuanzi. Each time these words were repeated louder and louder. The boy decided to get a mirror to use it. As soon as he took it out, he began to look at it carefully. Behind him, he saw some kind of dark clot. Eventually, a feminine silhouette emerged. Each time it became more and more. She turned to our hero, asking him to come to her. At that very moment, Yuanzi rushed forward with a scream as far as he could. She continued calling him while the boy ran away in terror. Running behind one of the buildings, he heard silence. That very call died down. The black-haired man decided to sit out the time to catch his breath. With heavy sighs, he rejoiced, because it seemed he had managed to break away. From the file, he learned that he couldn't turn around, but there was nothing said about returning. He assumed that upon his return, he would be in no danger. At that moment, he really wanted to go home, but there was no other choice. So, gathering his courage, he decided to go there again. Suddenly, one of the buildings caught his attention. Approaching the doors, he leaned against them. And at that very moment, the doors suddenly opened. This frightened our hero even more. He jumped back, feeling some kind of disgusting aura that was coming from inside. For the first time in a long time, a breeze blew here, raising a noise. This caught the attention of our protagonist because nothing like this had ever happened here before. Having pulled himself together a little, he finally decided to look inside. Inside, surprisingly, there was order, and he noticed an object on the table. It was a wooden ladle. Yuanzi was delighted. After all, I heard that the fluid of an innocent body can drive out evil. However, he immediately began to remember his past. Although he had not met the girl, he had managed to sin at home. Looking at his hands, he realized that he was giving them too much scope for sin. And then he lifted the ladle again and began to examine it. Looking at him, the black-haired boy's face changed. It was with a dissatisfied face that he threw it on the table, starting to walk from side to side in thought. He recalled the ancient words that said that true salvation lies in the heart of man. At that moment, his whole face turned red because it was virgin fluid that was meant. After thinking for a while, Yuanzi came to one conclusion. It is assumed that the first house was probably used for psychological comfort. Therefore, having taken the weapon as if it were his own, he left the building, starting to creep further and further. The second house was a real armory. Upon seeing the armory, he immediately threw away his weapons. After all, given the records found, it is quite expected that an armory was located on the temple grounds. Suddenly, Yuanzi noticed that the skeleton still had flesh left. There were only two options. The first was embalming, and the second was natural formation. The first option was excluded because the time was wrong and the climate was not suitable. The only clue to the corpse's death were two holes in its neck. At that very moment, our hero heard some sounds and immediately grabbed his weapon. Jumping back, he looked tensely towards the exit. He didn't understand where this noise came from. However, he was sure of one thing: he needed to go and check. Gathering his courage, Yuanzi went outside, listening. Having looked into one of the buildings, he looked around carefully. Inside this building, there were wooden coffins, around which lay corpses. But something else caught his attention. He noticed something brightly colored lying next to one of them. It resembled a knife, and the boy thought it was a Buddhist ceremonial weapon. Immediately remembering the statue, which was supposed to be holding something in its hands, his thoughts were interrupted by terrifying creaking and howling sounds. Right before his eyes, those very coffins began to move. The lids slowly opened, and disgusting hands appeared from them. Seeing this picture, the boy was naturally scared to death. Because his legs were numb from fear, he continued to stand in place. After some time, whatever was inside was completely released. It was a corpse that was moving. Yuanzi thought it was a zombie. The protagonist decided that this was the perfect moment to return to the main hall. And just as he was about to leave, he felt something. Turning around, he noticed something he didn't expect at all. It was the same demon that was sitting on his shoulder. With tears in his eyes, he shouted that he couldn't believe it, because 15 minutes had already passed. With a weight on his shoulders, he ran slowly towards the hall. The zombie vampire himself was watching the guy closely at this time, continuing to make those same disgusting sounds. Not for a single second without looking away. Still looking towards the running boy, his eyes filled with anger. As he ran, he cried, thinking about wanting to go home, remembering his uncle, grandmother, and aunt. At that moment, A powerful explosion was heard, and the boards flew in different directions. Naturally, the main character paid attention to this. The first to appear was a dried-up, bony leg, and behind her was a body that was making eerie sounds, radiating an equally eerie aura. Seeing him, our hero became scared and didn't understand what to do. Exactly the same thing will happen next. Deciding that the best option was to escape, Yuanzi began to run away. Noticing the monster's pose, the black-haired man was surprised because it was the pose of a professional runner. Seeing this run, the young boy did not understand how a crumbling corpse could run so fast. Yuanzi continued to scream, shouting, as this was beyond all bounds. Realizing that he couldn't escape, the boy tried to think of something. At that very moment, he stopped abruptly, swinging his weapon, trying to dodge the monster. The black-haired man didn't intend to die, he wanted to survive. Therefore, he decided to accept the fight, throwing his weapon forward. The rotting corpse stopped abruptly after the impact. The other part of this weapon crashed into the ground, thereby becoming stuck. At that moment, the main character looked to the side in his direction with alarm. The black-haired man noticed the torn-out heart, assuming that it was the same older brother mentioned in the monk's notes. At this time, the monster had already come to its senses and began to attack again. He became furious, and his anger could be felt throughout the entire area. Yuanzi jumped to the side, trying to increase the distance and dodge. At that moment, the boy managed to dodge. Deciding that this was the best moment to attack, Yuanzi rushed to attack. However, he didn't succeed. He hit the target, but nothing happened. At that moment, his hands began to tremble and he could barely hold the sword. He didn't understand why he couldn't cut his neck. Since the monster didn't feel anything, he immediately rushed to attack, about to pierce our hero's chest with his sharp nails. The monster's speed was higher, so he hit. The boy fell to the ground with a loud crash and a column of dust rose up. The zombie was going to kill the black-haired boy. At that moment, Yuanzi himself was summoning the banishing talisman. Immediately, a talisman began to form in his hand. Seeing this, the zombie stopped, noticing the bright light. Having come to its senses, the creature jumped back several meters. The zombie sensed danger from this light, so he retreated. Our hero was happy at this time because it worked, realizing that the zombie has intelligence, because it senses danger. Now all he could do was pray that the ghost of the girl from the well wouldn't appear here. He thought to himself that the ghost on his shoulder had already become like family, asking him to suck out his life energy more slowly. Their gazes met, neither of them moved. Yuanzi raised the talisman in front of him towards the zombies, immediately turning sharply to the side, starting to run to the side, straight towards the main hall of the temple. His strength was already running out. On his last breath, he tried to get there. Entering the main hall of the temple, he exhaled. It was too hard. The main character had no strength left. However, this time he was lucky. The boy was saved. Having caught his breath a little, he closed the door behind him. His arm was wounded, and he was holding back the blood that was coming from his shoulder. Yuanzi took off his jacket and thought that there was probably corpse poison in the zombie's claws. However, he did not have any medications or disinfectants with him. The young boy hoped that he would not die from the infection. But at that moment, he realized that he didn't feel any anxiety at all. Remembering this effect of the candle, he understood, and this meant that it had begun to work. As he reflected, he thought that there was no time to waste now. He needed to move straight to the second stage. He immediately started to think about the shoes in his head, because Guan had said that he could subjugate him. Yuanzi also thought that given the speed of that zombie, he wouldn't be able to place a banishing talisman on its forehead. I started to play out the situation in my head, how it would happen. Compare this to a child trying to kill an adult with a knife. He needed to come up with some kind of plan. At this point, he exhaled heavily. Starting to get up, he put his hand in his pocket, thinking that even despite the infection, he feels confident when taking out pills. He couldn't sit it out because he would simply die. So, after taking a little rest, I went outside and started calling for shoes. After shouting, there was no reaction. There was total silence. Suddenly, literally a couple of seconds later, the sound of stomping shoes was heard. Red shoes appeared on the horizon. With slow steps, they began to approach our hero. They appeared behind our main character. Seeing this, Yuanzi guessed that they had appeared there specifically to cut off the escape route to the main hall. The shoes asked our hero if he would like to dance with them. Hearing this question, the black-haired man was glad because he already knew about it. Closing his eyes, the young man began to reboot his brain. At that very moment, as soon as he concentrated, his eyes lit up. Our hero's body seemed to be placed in another reality. The whole world around us disappeared, and in our hero's head there was only him and his shoes. The shoes were the first to move. They showed the first movement. The red shoes turned to Yuanzi and said that it was their turn. The main character immediately began to play out the movements in his head, thinking to myself that now everything will be decided by one dance. Starting to dance, repeating the movements shown by the shoes. He thought to himself that it was good, because no one could see him now except for his red shoes. Otherwise, his dignity would be lost. A few seconds later, our boy completed his movements. At that moment, blood started pouring from his nose. He was too tired, hanging on by his last breath. The shoes began to disappear little by little, saying that it was a lousy dance. The system congratulated on the successful couple dance, but also added that they rated the dance low, so they will only be subject to it for half an hour. With his last breath, Yuanzi took out the pills. Having swallowed them, he tried to recover as quickly as possible. He exhaled heavily and was glad that he had managed to survive. The backstory told of a former owner who appeared to her as a princess, who was incredibly beautiful by nature and a masterful dancer. All the men of those lands dreamed of marrying her, but her evil stepmother envied her talent and beauty. She imprisoned the princess in a high tower, and the lonely girl danced in the cold rays of the moonlight until she finally died. These red shoes inherited the last wish of their owner, to wander endlessly and enjoy a solitary dance. After listening to the end, our hero looked at the functions of the artifact and was pleasantly surprised. After all, the shoes were capable of ignoring any obstacles, but he was almost immediately disappointed because he only had them for half an hour. But his despondency did not last long, because a smile immediately appeared on his face. He thought that this time would be enough, so he applied them immediately. They immediately slipped onto his feet, but at first it was difficult to get used to them. But still, with every step, he became more and more confident. Upon entering the building, Yuanzi noticed that the corpses, coffin, and knife were still in place. He didn't understand where Zhang Shi had gone, assuming that he had returned back to the coffin. He peered in, trying to see, but nothing was visible. Thinking about how mobs usually return to their starting position in games, he found it all strange, but at the same time he felt a sense of danger. At the last moment, he finally realized that it was coming from behind him. Turning around, he saw the same monk attacking him. However, the shoes had a much faster reaction, immediately removing our main character from the attack zone. The red shoes began to shine, and they began to dance again. At the very beginning, Yuanzi already felt very tired from using it, and the zombie monk himself continued to scream like a beast, making vile sounds. Once again, assuming that athletic stance, he charged. At that moment, the brand new feminine shoes started dancing again. Our hero began to shine in the dance, dodging each attack of the monster. The zombie couldn't keep up with the movements of our main character. The shoes not only made Yuanzi strain, but also made her feel pain. Having hit that very spot, the boy thought that they might burst, even starting to cry and ask them to slow down a little. The shoes weren't going to just dodge. Going on the attack, they dealt a direct blow to the zombies, throwing him back a few meters, dropping him on his back. Realizing that this might be his only chance, Yuanzi took out the banishing talisman. The living corpse, sensing danger, immediately tried to retreat. However, thanks to this artifact, our hero's speed was superior to that of the dead. The talisman hit the target, on the forehead of the former monk. The monster began to scream in pain. He could not remove it from his forehead. Yuanzi watched the events unfold silently at this moment, hoping for the best outcome. Gradually, the body began to disappear, evaporating into the air. However, our hero did not have time to think about this, because he felt wild pain. He felt a wild pain between his legs because of the splits. After moving away a little, he exhaled, because he was able to deal with Zhang Shi, knowing full well that he wouldn't have been able to do this without the help of the red shoes. Now it remained to deal with the next point. It was a ghost woman who appeared near the well. But first our boy went to the hall where that very dagger lay. Yuanzi picked it up and was about to check the stat window. It was called the Demon Generation Pestle, a type of weapon, and was an artifact. Holding it in his hand, the black-haired boy thought that his assumptions were correct. It was an artifact, quite powerful. His predecessor planned to use this weapon to kill Zhang Shi. However, he was unable to tame the red shoes and suffered terrible injuries, after which he had a cancerous encounter with the Zhang Shi monster, which ended in death. Yuanzi had about 5 minutes left before a vengeful spirit appeared on his shoulder. He needed to manage this in time and deal with the woman's ghost. But as soon as he looked into the well, the boy was quite surprised. She didn't understand where the woman was because he clearly remembered that the ghost had crawled out of here last time. The young man did not understand what was happening, clutching his weapon in anger. Looking around, he realized that his 15 minutes would soon be up, and in this case, he will have to return to the main hall. Realizing that there was no one around, he decided to go back. Inside, as always, a candle burned with a bright light, emitting that very warmth. Sitting on the ground, he touched his hand, examining it carefully. He understood that the effect of the cadaveric poison was increasing. He already felt difficulty breathing. His time was running out, but he was able to explore the 2 rear annexes and neutralize Zhang Shi. However, the quest had not yet been completed, which meant that there was still something left. He did not understand what. Starting to go over in his head what he had managed to notice, he tried to remember the unexplored area. Since the courtyard of the building was explored 100%, only one remains. This is the main hall. It was at this moment that he turned towards the statue, and it dawned on him that he must put the pestle of demon subjugation there. As Yuanzi began to climb up the statue, he was sure that this was the part that was missing. And so he successfully placed this very artifact into the hands of the goddess. And then he quickly jumped off her, falling onto her new shoes. Just a few seconds later, this majestic stone statue began to crack. The young boy watched all this, but now there was no fear in his eyes. Eventually, it shattered into tiny pieces and dust began to rise. The boy himself watched all this with a smile on his face. A sealed entrance appeared before him. He was glad to see it because he guessed right. Immediately, he began to throw stones in different directions, thus searching for the very artifact that he recently placed into the hands of the stone goddess. A few minutes later, he managed to find it and take it back into his hands. He understood that in the cave, he would be able to unravel why the temple had fallen into disrepair. Looking at the object, he felt the divine energy of the sun, but he had to sacrifice life energy, assuming that if it was the power of the sun, then it should dispel the darkness. But he was also troubled by the artifact's note, which said that power came at the price of life. He was confident that he would be the key to further research. The clues were too obvious, so he had no choice, and with these thoughts in mind, he stuck it into his leg. The blood only scattered for a moment, but the weapon began to absorb it almost immediately. And then it was completely filled with bright light, which rose higher and higher. When Yuanzi took it out, he didn't understand what was happening, but he didn't feel afraid. His eyes changed color, and they also filled with bright light. The artifact did not dispel the darkness, but it gave him the ability to see through it. And his condition was restored. Now he did not feel internal pain and difficulty breathing. The only discomfort was the bleeding wound. The black-haired man assumed that he had been able to neutralize the effects of the poison. He thought it was worth it, even though he literally had to make a sacrifice. Suddenly, the light in his eyes became even brighter, giving him even more energy. He saw artificial cuttings on both walls of the tunnel, which was not formed naturally. Yuanzi guessed that there was some kind of solution waiting for him at the end of the tunnel. As he went further, he heard a voice asking to be saved, asking for help. The young man did not understand whose voice it was, but it was definitely coming from the front. The further our hero walked, the more clearly and loudly he heard the voice. When he went inside, the guy's face changed. He didn't feel afraid, but he was terrified to look at all of this. A heart-rending picture appeared before his eyes, a huge number of faces, terrifying energy. Yuanzi heard the pleading cries of pain. They asked for help. Their eyes were filled with tears, and each time the heartbreaking scream became louder and louder. It has been a long time since a living soul last entered here. The branches of that very tree began to gradually cover their faces with their trunks. Eventually, within just a couple of seconds, the scream died down completely. Looking ahead, the black-haired man tensely asked who was standing in front of him. At that moment, the huge face with blue eyes replied that it was only a tree. After thinking for a bit, the protagonist asked if it was really he who killed the temple students, to which he immediately received a negative response from his interlocutor. The tree explained that this was the work of the mistress of Mount Sando, pointing to a scarlet coffin lying directly in front of him. Hearing this, the black-haired guy immediately ran it through his head. He remembered the very statue that towered in the main hall of the temple, thinking that this was the same night goddess who had ascended during the Ming dynasty. However, he did not understand why a divine being would kill ordinary students. The tree explained that the end of an era had come. It had become difficult for followers to achieve a breakthrough, and in order to gain immortality, the mistress of the mountain had fallen to the path of demons. She sealed herself in a stone coffin, using the banyan tree to imprison the evil spirits. all for the sake of nourishing the yin and preventing her primordial spirit from perishing. A powerful night goddess capable of absorbing souls to strengthen herself, Banyan absorbed too many souls, absorbing their will, and gradually gave birth to a spiritual mind. This spiritual mind was the tree itself, and over the course of many years, people wandered here by mistake and met their end here. And he absorbed the hatred of the vengeful spirits, and all the time waited for someone to come and put an end to the fallen goddess. After hearing this, Yuanzi thought for a moment, thinking that this was very similar to the launch of a quest from an NPC. After thinking for a bit, with the utmost calmness, he asked what he should do. His interlocutor immediately replied that he needed to open the stone coffin and pierce the heart of the mistress of the mountain. That was the only way he could put an end to everything. He also added that the weapon he found contained half of her soul, and by piercing her heart with it, it would be possible to seal the remaining part. Without the yang soul protecting her body, her flesh would immediately die, then he would be able to leave here unharmed. Seeing that the black-haired man continued to stand without moving, the tree asked why he was hesitating, and Yuanzi really stood there, motionless, completely immersed in thought. Looking up at the tree, he said he had a question. He asked if he could be the high priest of the temple from the stories. The tree was taken aback by this question, but almost immediately responded by saying that the temple priest was the first one to be absorbed by the mistress of the mountain. First, the priest became a puppet, and then a nourishing being. This time, the main character asked the tree to open the coffin for him. But he heard a refusal. His interlocutor explained that he was just a tree, so he couldn't help him with this. It was at that moment that a satisfied smile appeared on the young boy's face. Having asked what he rather does not want, he suggested that the senior priest of the temple lies there, and our hero also suggested that he is his soul or protector. There was a discrepancy in the story. The goddess was able to ascend and a temple was built in her honor, but the disappearance of the students occurred during the reign of Yongle. He also recalled the words where he was warned not to trust the master. Now our protagonist understood why the master sought to kill all the temple's students. The tree itself at that moment responded that from the very beginning it had no evil intentions towards him. It did not want to cause harm. And at this point our hero asked, maybe he just can't. After some thought, Yuanzi added that his favorite way to wring necks was to suggest that such a method was related to techniques that enslave the mind. At that very moment I remembered the situation with that very woman from the well. At this point the tree fell silent again, beginning to look attentively in the direction of our hero. The black-haired man himself shouted with a satisfied face that his interlocutor had become nervous. Having said that, the night wanderer who was sent to clean up before him clearly pointed out two things. The banyan tree is very dangerous, and one should not look back. Assuming that he had gone into depth to investigate the old well but had found nothing, because there had been no problem with that well at all, the problem was in the tree itself. Moreover, the ghost woman, to use his real name, although he indicated something else in the system, this confirmed the hypothesis that there was a mind enslavement technique involved, which affects his brain. The young boy also suggested that it was because of the pestle that he was immune to illusions, and that he had lured him here, hoping to deceive and kill him, since illusions were useless. It was with these words that the boy thrust the pestle filled with energy into the tree trunk. Having thus pierced it, the pestle began to go deeper and deeper, filled with warm energy that spread throughout the area. It began to gradually cover the trunk of the tree. At that very moment, the tree's branches began to grow at an incredible speed. They were about to attack the black-haired boy right now. The tree itself changed its face, shouting that since he did not want to obey it, then he should just die right now. With great speed, the branches began to approach the young wanderer of the night. While he stood there, not moving at all, he became confused. But he came to his senses in time, dodging the attack thanks to his shoes. The tree itself wasn't going to let the boy go so easily, so it rushed into attack again. Yuanzi dodged the insanely fast attack once again. This turn of events angered the ancient tree quite a bit. Therefore, it began to inflict a huge number of attacks with even greater fury. But Yuanzi wasn't so easy as he continued to dodge each of them, finding a small moment to counterattack. Crouching down, he began to concentrate all his strength in his legs, rushing with incredible speed towards the main trunk. He couldn't just let him get close to him. Therefore, I immediately went on the defensive and the ground began to crack. And right from it, fairly thick arrays of branches began to form upwards. Yuanzi swung his pestle forward with all his might. In an instant, the weapon reached its target, piercing the face of the tree. In 1 second, it was covered with a bright light, which transformed into a flame. From the pain, the ancient spirit began to scream in pain, because his whole body began to burn. But the young wanderer was not going to stop there. Accelerating, overcoming obstacles, he approached the main trunk. The boy knew he had to push the pestle in even deeper, so grabbing it, he tried with all his strength to push it as deep as possible. And he succeeded. The pestle went in all the way, raising an even brighter light. There was a scream loud enough to deafen the entire area. All the young boy managed to do was cover his face. A dark aura began to appear in the room, filling the entire area. But ultimately, thanks to this artifact, she disappeared completely. The room was filled with pleasant moonlight again. Yuanzi stood silently, looking around. Suddenly, I anxiously remembered my shoes and immediately deactivated them. They gradually began to disappear from his feet, returning to his inventory. At this point, victory was in his pocket. The young man breathed a sigh of relief, thinking about how he had barely made it in time. After all, just a little bit more and the shoes would have disappeared. At that very moment, something caught his eye. Looking around, he noticed a system window that congratulated him on completing the S-rank mission challenge and awarded him a reward. He received the Nightwalker as well as the demon-slaying pestle, and they also left him the red shoes. The exit will open in 5 minutes. The black-haired guy read every word with trepidation. He couldn't believe that he had managed to survive here. It was too hard. But as soon as Yuanzi came to his senses, he immediately screamed at the top of his voice. Thus, the test that no one could pass for decades was officially closed today. Intending to test his skills, he sat down on the ground, crossing his legs. As he began to concentrate his energy, a dark mark immediately appeared on his forehead. And then the whole body was immersed in some kind of purple energy. All the wounds on his body began to gradually heal and then disappeared completely. Opening his eyes, he felt a huge surge of energy. His whole body felt wildly light. He hadn't experienced such a wonderful feeling for a long time. He immediately started jumping for joy because everything worked out for him. He couldn't be more happy about it. But almost immediately, the joy disappeared because he saw something he was not prepared for. His body lay right in front of him, without any movement. It was unconscious. After examining himself, he did not understand how he was able to float in the air, assuming that he was dead. At that very moment, he started to get hysterical. He didn't know what to do in such a situation. But just a few seconds later, he returned back to his native body. Exhaling easily, he managed to think that he would die. The system window appeared in front of his face again. He decided to look at his character. Opening the stats window, he saw the first level. His progress was at 20%, and also read about the new ability. As he studied them, he thought, because he was able to finally unlock his class, and the use time of the shoes was also reset. This meant that he had completely succeeded in subjugating this artifact. But all this time, one thought did not leave him. Although the tree had disappeared, the same scarlet coffin still remained in its place. Lost in thought, Yuanzi thought that since the progress had reached 100%, it meant that the tree was the guardian of the temple. He guessed that the stone coffin was empty. Looking at the timer, he saw that he had little time left. He felt a terrible curiosity, so he activated the shoes just in case. They immediately appeared on his feet. He was going to check what was in the coffin. That's why he immediately began to approach him, believing that with his shoes he would feel calmer. Using a pestle, he cut all the branches that were blocking his passage. The coffin was quite large, and the young man examined it carefully. He immediately grabbed the roof and began to push it to the side, trying to move it. At some point, the lid was thrown off, and a fairly loud crash was heard, raising a column of dust behind it. With a surprised face, the night wanderer peered inside the coffin. And as soon as the dust cleared, he was very surprised. He could not believe his eyes. After all, inside this coffin lay a black-haired girl. Having examined her, our hero assumed that this was the very goddess of this temple. He couldn't understand how she had preserved her body. It surprised him quite a lot. I immediately started to spin the conversation in my head like a tree. After all, it truly spoke of the fact that the mistress of the mountain lay here. The boy couldn't believe that it told him the truth. He didn't understand what the catch was. As he began to pace back and forth, he reflected that since the mission had been completed 100%, he was right in his conclusions. Assuming that the body of the mountain's mistress was a hidden mission, he immediately closed the coffin lid. Stepping aside, he even thought that it was at this moment that his death would come. He also thought that if the body of a goddess was lying there, then there was an even deeper plot to this test. Coming up again, he decided to close the lid completely, pretending that he had not seen anything. But at that very moment, I noticed that there was something brightly colored in the girl's mouth. He tried to examine the thing from different angles, but he saw nothing. Yuanzi looked at his hands and told them that he had spoiled them too much. But interest truly outweighed fear, so he swallowed his saliva and decided to take a serious step. Slowly moving his hand to her chin, he opened her mouth as gently as possible. And then, I also carefully tried to touch the object to look at the characteristics window. It was a crystal of spiritual essence, a consumable type, a soul crystal purified by the power of an ancient deity. Containing immense spiritual energy, this supplement was the one most coveted by the Night Wanderer. The note stated that the mountain goddess had already purified the crystal of impurities, and he could use it without danger. After reading this to the end, Yuanzi naturally wondered whether he should do this. Having made a positive decision, he immediately carefully grabbed it and began to take it out. In response, the crystal began to shine brightly, and in an instant, rays began to hit the guy's forehead. His experience progress reached 22%, and energy was seething throughout the boy's body. He felt an incredible surge of energy, feeling like he could beat up an entire crowd. He liked the feeling, but after containing his emotions, he came to his senses. He immediately bowed and thanked the goddess, wishing her to rest in peace. And then, very slowly and just as carefully, he began to return the coffin lid to its place. The 10-second countdown to return began, at which point Yuanzi let out a sigh of relief. It didn't change anything for him to return, but he was confused by the noise that began to be emitted. It was actually coming from right behind him, from that very coffin. Scarlet energy began to bulge out from the coffin, rising higher and higher. A thin, feminine hand appeared behind her, which grabbed hold of a part of the coffin, and the rest of the body began to rise. Literally in a matter of seconds, the body of that very deceased goddess appeared. Seeing this, the young wanderer's body naturally changed dramatically. After all, he had recently seen a dead girl, and now she was completely fine. She immediately looked around, starting to look attentively in the guy's direction. Yuanzi himself froze in place, trying not to move at all. With each passing second, his face became more and more frightened. The ancient goddess herself continued to look attentively towards the guy. After looking him over from head to toe, she smiled sweetly. And at that very moment, Yuanzi was plunged into horror. He could not believe that the corpse had come to life. The countdown began, 4 seconds left until return, and the girl told him that she would definitely come for him. The guy's body fell into a trance. It began to gradually dissolve into some other world. This hadn't happened last time. The Night Wanderer experienced this strange feeling for the first time. He didn't understand what was happening at the moment. Suddenly his body felt a pleasant, homely breeze. Pleasant rays of the sun began to illuminate the eyes of our hero. Our hero fell easily onto his native bed. The last words he heard before returning haunted him. Each one, over and over again in his head, was thinking that she would definitely come for him. At that very moment, he noticed that the shoes were still on his feet. The young man immediately intensely deactivated them. Exhaling easily, he said that he almost got caught. However, thoughts about that very girl did not leave him because she meant something. Leaving the room, the black-haired man thought that it didn't matter what the girl told him, because everything was left behind, in that spirit world. As soon as he left, the ant immediately asked what time he went to bed, because it was as if he had just disappeared. Yuanzi himself was not offended by her as usual, but on the contrary, he rushed to hug her, shouting that he missed her, also adding that this morning everything around seems unusually beautiful. At the same time, there was a gloomy silence in the office, because quite a lot of time had already passed. Investigator Li asked Investigator Guan if there was any news from Yuanxi. She said anxiously that she had called him 5 or 6 times, but the guy's phone was switched off. At that moment, the boss himself also tensely responded that they still needed to wait a little longer. With a smile on her face, Gon said that the result is still unknown. Behind them, the bespectacled man said that perhaps not everything would be as joyful as they hoped. He started to talk about how their new colleague had roughly equal chances of death and survival, which really put his colleagues on edge. In one voice, they shouted at him to shut up. The bespectacled man immediately fell silent, not understanding what he had said wrong. His colleagues, in turn, put their hands to their heads, thinking that he was a real idiot. The girl kept going over the guy's words in her head about how the baby looked good and spoke so beautifully, even thinking that he could brighten up her dull, everyday life. But throwing these thoughts aside, she said something else out loud. She regretted it, because this was not destined to be. Stretching, she said that if they couldn't contact him by the end of the working day, then they would hardly be able to hope for anything. The boss, leaving, asked to report to him immediately if anything was known. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted, as Guan's phone rang loudly. The departing boss stopped immediately, hoping that it was their baby calling. There was a photograph of our main character on the phone ringing. Guan glanced at her phone and saw her colleague's name, immediately shouting about it throughout the office. Grabbing the phone, she looked at Investigator Lee in confusion, who, with relief, asked to put it on speakerphone. Having picked it up, she immediately anxiously asked Yuanqi if it was this, to which she immediately heard a positive answer. In a sweet voice, Yuanzi greeted his sister, saying that it was him. As he walked down the stairs with joy in his voice, he also added that he had been able to pass the test and also successfully return from the spirit world. Hearing this, everyone was surprised, even the bespectacled man, who at first glance seemed extremely reserved. The boss started jumping for joy, shouting that this was a real miracle. He couldn't believe his ears. However, almost immediately he began to cough. Stopping, he felt ashamed, mentally asking himself to restrain himself. Investigator Lee began to think that the Yulin Tunnel, which the Tai sect had declared impossible to pass through, had been successfully cleared. This will undoubtedly cause a stir, and Yuanqi's name will spread after his first mission. In addition, the rewards in the S-rank spirit world are incredibly generous, and the first clearing is especially important. It is the shortest path to strengthening the organization. Moreover, there was another important point. In all of Shanghai, one could count on one hand the trials for the Night Wanderers. The existence of the Yulin Tunnel led to the organization losing many future Night Wanderers. But now, if a detailed guide were compiled, the number of new Night Wanderers would steadily increase every year. Of course, in the future, the rewards will not be as generous as during the first cleanup. But for the official side, the very fact of an increase in the number of Night Wanderers is important. This is enough to attract the attention of the Council of Elders. Guan, with surprise in her voice, asked how the young wanderer managed to do this, and he, hailing a taxi, replied that it wasn't that difficult, adding that anyone with a pair of working legs could do it too. Hearing these words, the boss rejoiced, thinking that this was a great job, and ordered the guy to come to headquarters immediately. At this point, their telephone conversation ended and Yuanzi hung up. The bespectacled man, turning to the boss, said that the guy clearly had talent, also saying that his boss had picked a real monster. Hearing these words, the soul of their leader rejoiced. It was visible on his face. The boss responded by saying that he was not a monster, but a real genius, adding that it would be a good addition to the notification letter, words specifically about the monster. Arriving at the office, he immediately turned to Mr. Fu, writing that he was in a hurry to convey to him extremely important news. Adding that his wanderer had completed the test and returned, he added that he was referring to the Yulin Tunnel test. Instantly, a call came on his phone. Seeing the call from Commander Fu, Investigator Lee laughed because the call came quickly. The gray-haired man picked up the phone and greeted me with a satisfied voice. Commander Fu immediately said that the man must understand how important his message was. Naturally, the gray-haired man responded positively, saying that he himself was still in amazement and had only recently finished a telephone conversation with the newcomer. The logical question that immediately followed was whether a guide had been developed. However, Lee refused, saying that it would take them some time. The commander spoke again, saying that he had not placed any hope on him, because if this man could pass through the Yulin Tunnel, then he must have outstanding skills even by the standards of the Night Wanderers. Having added that Lee was lucky to have acquired a true genius, he intended to report this to the Council of Elders and make sure that he was rewarded. Hearing this, the investigator was surprised and delighted. However, he immediately asked if he should by any chance keep it a secret. After all, Tai has priority in recruiting wanderers, but Commander Fu replied that they themselves said they were not interested, so he did not need to worry about it. The commander also asked to avoid a repeat of the previous situation, to which Lee asked him for advice. With a smile on his face, the superior officer answered easily, he just needed to add money. Hearing this answer, the chief was quite surprised. But the commander replied that he also didn't like to win people over with money. He also added that he should write the manual as soon as possible. He needed complete information about the temple, and at the same time he decided to pay back the Tai sect. Upon hearing these instructions, Chief Lee immediately replied that he had completed everything in the shortest possible time. At this point, their conversation ended and the commander put the phone down. With a smile on his face, The investigator said that Centurion Fu was not in vain considered the money prince among the 4 masters of the organization. The crowd in the Spirit World's Wanderers chat was jubilant. Everyone was asking about the young Night Wanderer who had gone to test the temple. Everyone was betting that he was already dead. After reading all these conversations, Investigator Lee smiled and was amused by them, immediately starting to write about how they shouldn't rush to their conclusions. He wrote to them that he was very grateful for the experience, and also added that the young man managed to pass the test. At that moment, the chat immediately exploded. He could never believe it. One of the members of this chat could not believe his eyes, because this simply could not be happening. It was one of the members of the Thai sect who couldn't just take it and believe it. He didn't understand how they had missed out on such a promising wanderer of the night. He clutched his head, thinking that their elder had made a mistake. At this time, our main character had already arrived at headquarters. Having climbed the stairs, he immediately knocked on the door and then opened it. With a satisfied face, he immediately greeted everyone, saying that he had returned. He immediately ran into Guan, who said that she thought he was a harmless puppy, but turned out to be a real wolf cub. With a sweet face, she congratulated him, telling him to come to her so that she could hug him. But the boy just laughed, saying that it was too valuable a reward for this, deciding to leave it for another time. Thinking to himself that she was clearly trying to seduce him, he believed that he should be reasonable in such situations. Hearing this answer, the girl laughed, saying that his feigned seriousness was touching. They immediately went to the chief because he wanted to see the wanderer. As she walked, she praised him, suggesting that he had reaped a good harvest, and also added that there was no need to tell anything, since hiding one's methods and strength was a necessity for every wanderer. Naturally, our hero understood this because he wasn't going to tell anything anyway. In response, he simply thanked the girl walking next to him for the advice. Entering the boss's office, he immediately greeted him with joy on his face. Yuanzi was glad to see familiar faces, because before this he thought that he would never see them again. The boss took the lead in the conversation, saying that he had been very worried about him after the call. Hearing these words, the young wanderer of the night did not understand what he meant. Smoking a cigarette, Investigator Lee replied that he was afraid he would be kidnapped on the way to his office. He immediately asked if he wanted something to drink, to which the boy replied cola. The chief immediately ordered Guan to send someone for cola. Hearing this, she laughed, telling Yuanzi that his status had risen right before his eyes. While pouring wine, the chef praised the guy, saying that the younger generation was amazing. He also added that he would have to ask him to write a detailed guide on how to get through the tunnel. Naturally, our hero was not against it, but the chief interrupted him, asking if he had found any noteworthy information about the temple. At that moment, a bespectacled man walked into his office holding a laptop in his hands. As he walked in, he adjusted his glasses and asked if he could join in, to which he received a positive response and also received an order to help the young man compile a report. And so a whole hour of incessant conversations passed. Yuanzi told everything he wanted to tell, leaving out the details that the red shoes were an exclusive reward. Chief Lee focused on the demon subjugation pestle, asking if it was of a high level. However, without waiting for an answer, he added that they jokingly call the spirit world a game. But, of course, everything was much more serious, because in the spiritual world, artifacts are extremely rare, and each of them has a uniqueness, also adding that if he took out this artifact, then the task of killing the demon may disappear. Therefore, the tunnel's complexity may increase. Guan explained to the young man that spiritual worlds are subject to dynamic changes, such as taking an artifact, decreasing, dying, and leaving, increasing. She also explained that the levels and tasks differ, and the guide is only good for general information. The bespectacled man added that since the shoes remained in the spirit world, he thought the difficulty wouldn't decrease. Hearing this, our hero became a little flustered, because at this point he had deceived. But the guy who was collecting information about the tunnel said that the information did not correspond to the difficulty of S rank. I asked Yuanzi if he had forgotten to mention anything, but he immediately heard a negative answer. Looking away, the black-haired man said in a slightly trembling voice that he was just about to tell her. Because in the cave, in addition to the tree demon, there was a stone coffin. At this point, the chief of the stone coffin intervened in their conversation. He was interested in it and asked what was in it. There was silence in the chief's office as everyone waited for the protagonist's answer. With a gloomy face, the young man answered the truth, saying that the body of the mistress of the mountain lay there, and after he removed the lid, she woke up. The boss was the first to come to his senses. He shouted and asked again. He immediately jumped up and started walking from side to side. He thought that if she really woke up, then there were only two possible outcomes. First, the temple will no longer be just a challenge and will be upgraded to a high-level instance. The second, Old Temple will have its difficulty level lowered, but a new high-level instance will appear. For the leadership of the Thai sect, such changes in the spiritual worlds are extremely important. Guan encouraged the guy, telling him to continue. The more important his information, the higher the pay would be. The black-haired man immediately began waving his arms, saying that money was not so important. Now he was more worried that this ancient goddess might come for him. The bespectacled man told the protagonist not to exaggerate, saying that he was not yet mature enough to be noticed by such powerful beings. Yuanzi was naturally not reassured by this answer, but thanked him for the encouragement. Guan immediately changed the subject, asking if this goddess was more beautiful than her, to which our main character replied that he was much more beautiful than she was. Moreover, the bespectacled man added that she was more valuable as a research subject. Naturally, Guan didn't like this, and with an angry face, she asked the guys if they were by any chance tired